You're obsessed with that movie.
Okay! Linda Fiorentino, fucking that guy, up against the chain link fence!
I'm never having one of those, oh my God, what have I done, epiphanies.
I hated that movie.
Alright, today I'm going to be talking about HBO's series Sex and the City and why the pilot episode is such a gem. Now, Sex and the City is up there along with Daria for me in terms of comfort shows. I believe I watched it first my freshman year of college, but I only made it to about season 3 because Carrie was starting to annoy me and the writing was just kind of starting to fall off a bit for me. And then I started it again in quarantine of 2020, but admittedly I still have only made it to about I think midway through season 5, or I can't remember if I finished season 5, but I've made it to at least that point and I've seen both of the movies. The Carrie and Big storyline past season 3 is just like unbearable to me, and by season 5 things are just getting very interesting. I will make a completely different video about that. So today we're going to focus on the good and the first season, but I just wanted to put that out there that I have not seen the show in its entirety, but I feel like I've seen enough. Now, Sex and the City has always had a lot of controversy surrounding it during its airing in 1998 and even now up until today. And as we've grown more collectively critical of political incorrectness in forms of media that we deem classics, Sex and the City has not been exempt from these criticisms. However, I do stand firm in my opinion that I think the first season is kind of its own standalone entity and can kind of be exempt from most of these criticisms, not all of them, but I do think majority of the ones that you hear about the show are mostly applied to season 2 and further, so I'll get into that more later. Nonetheless, this show has gotten me through a very difficult time, and it's one of the things that I like to throw on when I'm feeling anxious, alongside Daria in the 1976 Charlie's Angels series. So it's just been brewing in my head about videos that I want to do about it, so this is going to be the first of many that I will make about Sex and the City. But without further ado, let's get into why the pilot is so good. Sex and the City aired its pilot episode on June 6, 1998, and I made a similar comment about Daria, but I feel like a lot of shows that started in the late 90s had a very distinct feeling to them that kind of started to get a little bit lost as they transitioned into the early 2000s era. They shot with the Super 16mm camera type, and I won't pretend to thoroughly understand what that means, but Kevin McDougall does a really good job at breaking down the difference between regular and Super 16mm cameras, and just the importance of the history of them and what they're typically used for. So that really helped me understand what it meant, and I will link that in the description if you'd like to check it out. But from using this camera, the show has a very grainy and raw feeling aesthetic, and I feel like this matches the candid approach that they were trying to take to representing New York in the 90s. Throughout the 20th century, New York had typically been shown as either a paradise for all things show business related, or a doomed city riddled by poverty and sin by the media. So I think it was interesting to have a show proposed that was going to take more of a well-rounded approach to New York instead of just one or the other. And I believe this is another reason why the show was so popular during its promo and then eventually during its airing in the 90s. Another reason Sex and the City was so popular was because of the all-female ensemble and how often they talked openly about sex in the city. The fact that they were all starting the show in their late 30s to early 40s was also an attention grabber, and it doesn't hurt that they're all beautiful with their own unique style. Charlotte, who was played by Christine Davis, typically has a more classic old Hollywood look to her, but meets business professional because she owns her own art gallery. Miranda, played by Cynthia Nixon, as well as Samantha, played by Kim Cattrall, are also typically in business professional attire throughout the series, especially season 1. But Miranda takes more of a masculine approach with suits and well enough fitted silhouettes, but not too tight, whereas Samantha usually prefers a more tight-fitted pencil skirt moment. And Carrie, of course, played by Sarah Jessica Parker, is the wild child of the group, so her style honestly fluctuates a lot, but we can always depend on her to serve, period. So like I mentioned, Sex and the City has faced a lot of criticism. One of the main points of critique stemmed from the lack of people of color casted in the show, as well as many politically incorrect moments scattered across the series, ranging from how they represented the transgender community, bisexual erasure in season 3, I believe it was, or late season 2. No, it was season 3. Conservative ideas about sex, despite the show promoting itself as being very progressive and sex forward and sex positive, and a lot more. Now, while all of these critiques are completely valid, I do personally feel like most of them come into play at the start of season 2 forward. Now, season 1 wasn't trying to be anything more than it was. It was just a candid look into the romantic lives of grown, albeit white, women in New York in the 90s. But by season 2, the show had exploded in popularity, and I feel like there was more pressure for it to represent the whole image of New York. So it was more off-putting to only see people of color being casted as set fillers, essentially, and just little side roles here and there, and to have conservative sentiments run so rampant in the script at that time. My biggest issue with the first season was all of the depictions of casual sex, and how we as the viewers were just supposed to assume that protection was being used. The AIDS/HIV epidemic was peaking at this time, so you would think that they would make it a bigger priority to promote safe sex. If they wanted to argue that they were trying to show the reality that many adults were still having unprotected sex at that time, then I think that it should have been brought up more explicitly than 2 or 3 seasons in when Samantha had that whole episode about going to get tested. So I feel like the sex in season 1 is very romanticized. They skip over the foreplay, they skip over the protection. Only maybe on a couple occasions do we see like a rapper somewhere see somebody like talking about a condom, but it's very rare, and it's like usually like a one-off joke or something like that. So you would think that they would really make it clear, like, yes, condoms are being used here, and if not, we're doing a think piece on how adults in New York are still not being responsible. But no, it was just, just kind of thrown to the side. So that's kind of an issue that I have with it. And I just kind of have to like remove myself from the reality of the situation when I'm watching it. But I do think that's a big issue. Now let's get into what I actually love about the pilot. 2 of my favorite aspects of not just the pilot, but the entire first season is the soundtrack and the interior set designs. To be quite frank, I'm obsessed.
No, I don't think you understand. I'm obsessed.
The first season of Sex and the City rarely has any songs with actual lyrics in them playing unless Mr. Big has something on a record player or something like that. But for the most part, the show heavily utilizes instrumentals, specifically jazz, and then occasionally, more techno vibes when they're in a club scene or something like that. But it is usually mostly jazz. And one of my favorite sequences ever is when Carrie is interviewing her friends about power dynamics between men and women in New York in the 90s in the pilot.
I explore these sorts of issues in my column, and I have terrific sources, my friends.
When you're a young guy in your 20s, women are controlling the relationships. By the time you're an eligible man in your 30s, you feel like you're being devoured by women. Suddenly, the guys are holding all the chips. I call it the mid-30s power flip.
I've tried so hard to find this song by itself, and I can't, so if you know where to find it, please let me know. Anyways, this fourth wall breaking aspect of the show was only the most prominent in the first season. They still did it occasionally in the second season, but it definitely began to taper off, which I just think is really unfortunate because I feel like it really gave the show something unique, but we can't win everything. Moving on, the interior set design of this show is just, I can't say enough about it. Capote Duncan's loft apartment in the pilot literally fell right out of Architectural Digest. We have the all-white walls and furniture with the wooden flooring, the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out into the city, the floral lamps, which give me such 80s IKEA catalog vibes, and a fireplace with a black piano housing record players sitting next to it. This loft could not be more 90s upper middle class single white man if it wanted to, and I absolutely love it. Also, as a small side note, Carrie's apartment in the pilot is definitely different from the one that she lives in for the rest of the series. In the pilot, she has a faux window that leads into her living room, but in the rest of the show, her window's out looking to the street. And the front door placement is also different, as well as the color of the door. I didn't even notice this at first, but after watching the pilot so many times, I peeped it, like, wait, she was looking out her window, but then she moved into her living room. And I'm like, that is not how that works. Overall, her apartment in the pilot looks a lot smaller than where she lives the rest of the show. And honestly, the one in the pilot is cute, but I'm definitely more partial to the one that she lives in for the rest of the series. So all in all, these components make it so that the pilot episode is not only aesthetically pleasing to the eyes, but also to the ears. The dialogue feels natural, the actresses have great chemistry on screen together, the soundtrack is never too distracting, and the styling is just gorgeous. Now, for those who have seen most of or the entirety of the show, this next portion is for you. Carrie's styling. So in the pilot, Carrie's look was really unique compared to how she was typically styled throughout the rest of the series. She's sporting a shorter cut with dirty blonde coloring, but we can observe her signature long blonde and curly look in the very next episode. Her makeup also stands out in the pilot with more nude lip colors and subtle eyeshadow, but in the following episode, she has more of a typical Hollywood makeup look with blue eyeshadow, bright blush, red lipstick, the whole 9 yards. So overall, Carrie's entire situation between her styling and her apartment did a 180 after the pilot. I wonder if this is an attempt to de-age her a little bit, because in the pilot her look was very mature, but she looks a lot more youthful in the following episodes. And since she's meant to be the youngest in the ensemble, I wonder if this was intentional to kind of make her stand out a bit more from her older counterparts. Just a thought. Samantha's relationship with love, or lack thereof. In the pilot, Miranda says a line that could be interpreted as foreshadowing of Samantha's storyline.
I have a friend who'd always gone out with extremely sexy guys and just had a good time. One day, she woke up and she was 41. She couldn't get any more dates. She had a complete physical breakdown, couldn't hold on to her job, and had to move back to Wisconsin to live with her mother.
Now, if you've watched the show and the movies, you know it doesn't exactly happen like this, but Samantha definitely experiences a range of emotions towards the concept of love throughout the show, and many viewers agree that she has one of the most wholesome and rewarding conclusions of her storyline by the end of her journey. Even in the pilot, we can see her feeling a bit conflicted about having casual sex with Capote Duncan by her facial expressions. We know that she went there with the intentions of having casual sex, but it almost seems like she was hoping for a little bit more and got a twinge of disappointment when she didn't get it, but then she just came back around to her original mindset and continued on what she came there to do. This back and forth can be observed pretty consistently throughout the show with Samantha, and you know, it does turn around eventually, but she does kind of go back and forth a lot. Charlotte's philosophy. Now, I would go into depth about how Charlotte's philosophy on relationships developed, but The Take already did a great video about this titled Why Charlotte Was Wrong. I'll throw that link in the description, but I'll just sum it up and say that Charlotte, along with Samantha, also has a very redeeming turnaround in her character development throughout the show. She's arguably my favorite out of all of them. She's a little bit obnoxious at first, but I think just in terms of her styling and her dialogue and just how things go for her, I feel like she has one of the most relatable plot lines, especially with her being on the younger side. I used to think she was the youngest one in the group, but I think she's the second youngest. But I feel like to most women who are either in their late 20s or their early to mid 30s, who are looking for marriage, especially in such a big city, I do think a lot of her trepidations and a lot of the stuff that she was caught up on and the stuff that she had to unlearn is very common for women even now when it's not the 90s. So I just always loved her story, and she just always looks snatched. Like, it's just hard to not be in awe when you see her come onto the screen. So there's that. Miranda's realism. So Miranda's monologue in the beginning of the pilot perfectly encapsulates her entire outlook on love and dating for majority of the series until she meets Steve.
By the time you reach your mid-30s, you think, why should I settle? You know?
Yeah, there's not one woman in New York who hasn't turned down 10 wonderful guys because they were too short or too fat or too poor.
I have been out with some of those guys, the short, fat, poor ones. It makes absolutely no difference. They are just as self-centered and unappreciative as the good-looking ones.
Now, I have a lot of mixed feelings about Miranda and Steve, and I will probably do a whole video on that, but I do appreciate how refreshingly kind he was compared to the bums that she was messing with before he came into the picture. He wasn't perfect by any means, but he was always very in tune with her emotions, and I guess that's really all you could ask for at a certain point. But he definitely does give me heavy Cancer Man vibes, just sensitive, a little bit irrational, a little bit deluded, a little bit confused. And I just think the fact that she was so successful and he was still getting to where he wanted to be in life. He wasn't unsuccessful, but they were moving at a very different pace. And again, I will go into this probably in a whole nother episode, but I just think that insecurity that inspired in him, as well as every other man that she met, made things very difficult to her. In my opinion, Miranda should have been a lesbian. But anyways, I'm not even about to get into all that right now. So another major reason why I love the pilot and the first season as a whole is that Carrie and Mr. Big were definitely involved, but the focus was much more on the bond of the main four characters in their personal lives. It didn't feel like Charlotte, Miranda, and Samantha were just side characters, but rather that all four of them were equally important and brought equal value to the plot. Once season 2 starts, however, there's definitely more of a Carrie and Co. feeling to everything, which I really despise, because honestly, I feel like Carrie kind of has what was her name, Sam or whatever, from Orange is the New Black syndrome, where she's the main character but it's actually kind of the least interesting one. But we'll get into that in another video. We actually saw Carrie writing very often, almost every single day in the first season, but as she gets more wrapped up in her situation with Mr. Big, we see her fall off from doing even that, which definitely raises eyebrows about how she lived such a lavish lifestyle when barely even doing the little amount of work that she was supposed to be doing. Whole thing is very sus. But anyways, so again, between the soundtrack, the occasional breaking of the fourth wall, the set design, the styling, the writing, even down to the type of camera being used, the pilot and season 1 as a whole possess a type of late 90s charm that began to slip as the show progresses into the second season. I could go on forever about even more minute details about what I love about the pilot, but as I said, I plan to do many more videos about Sex and the City, and I don't want this one to be too long, so I'm just gonna wrap it up here. But again, I intend to make videos about probably each of the women and their character development. There's some conspiracy theories that I have, one of them being that Skipper and Steve were actually supposed to be the same person, because think about it. I can see the wheels turning already in your head, and I'm gonna make a video because this is something that really keeps me up at night, to be honest. Maybe a style breakdown here or there, and much more. So if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe so you know when I upload more, and also be sure to give me a like if you enjoyed, and thank you if you made it to this point in the video. I'll see you next time.